Coming to you from the Forge of Freedom studio in the heart of America. A podcast dedicated to preserving freedom and inspiring personal success. Freedom is born and lives through you, the individual, and it dies in the shadows of tyranny. Motivating our listeners to become well-rounded, freedom-minded people with the body of an athlete, the mind of a stoic, and the spirit of a warrior. The tree of liberty lives on through you, the Forge of Freedom. And now here's your host, Alex Uli.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Forge of Freedom podcast. I'm your host, Alex Uli, and this is episode 94 of the Forge of Freedom. Today, for Monday Gun Day, I've got Mike Uli back in the studio to talk about a few things. First of all, we're going to provide you with an update with respect to the sensitive places ban in California. We discussed a little bit in the last episode, but there's been an update since the last time we were on. And we're also going to talk to you today about body armor. It's a type of arm that is not talked about a whole lot in Second Amendment and self-defense media, and we just want to give you some basic information about body armor, why people might want it. You know, there's lots of people who say, why would you want body armor? That seems like something that only preppers or people who are paranoid would have. But I think there's more to it than that. So with that said, Mike, before we get into the news, welcome back to the studio.
Hey, thanks for having me, Alex.
Yeah.
Sorry. Thanks for having me. Didn't have the microphone over there.
Yeah, I can start over.
No, you can leave that in there. I mean,
yeah, it's okay.
All right. Sorry.
You're good. I'll just mark it.
It's a good time to edit.
Yeah. Okay. Wave. That way I know that it's the mark. All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Forge of Freedom podcast. I'm your host, Alex Uli, and this is episode 94 of the Forge of Freedom. Today, for Monday Gun Day, I've got Mike Uli back in the studio. Welcome back to the studio, Mike.
Thanks for having me, Alex.
And today, we're going to talk about just a brief update with the news and the sensitive places ban out in California. We talked about it a little bit in the last episode, at least the last Monday Gun Day episode, and that's the May v. Bonta case. But we're also going to talk, and our primary topic for the day is going to be about body armor. And of course, this is something that's not discussed quite as much in the self-defense and the Second Amendment media, but I think it's worthwhile thinking about it and at least knowing about and what to consider. You know, lots of folks think, why would I want body armor? That's something that only preppers and people who are paranoid have. But I think there's more to it than that, and something that's worth considering for lots of folks. And a lot of people don't know what the law is. So we'll talk a little bit about sort of the ins and outs of body armor, but also some of the law surrounding body armor. So with that said, Mike, let's talk a little bit about so-called SB2 out in California, which is, of course, the sensitive places ban out there. It was a Bruen response bill. Those who don't know, Bruen, it was a decision, the most recent decision by the Supreme Court with respect to the Second Amendment, was built on top of the Heller and the McDonald decision. And it really spurred a lot of litigation in the federal courts throughout the country. And there are states like California, Hawaii, Massachusetts, Connecticut, New York that have passed bills to try to minimize freedom in response to Bruen. And one of the ways that they're doing that is with so-called sensitive places bans. And in California, this SB2 basically made just about anywhere you might go off limits, calling nearly every place a sensitive place where a firearm cannot be carried.
And you're not exaggerating that. It literally is almost every place in the state of California.
Yeah. And the opinion, I'll link to this if I can remember to. I know I linked to it in the last Monday Gun Day episode, but I'll link to the opinion. I read through the entire opinion. It was a very good one from the district court out there in California, which is, of course, the lowest level court in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. And the opinion issued an injunction with respect to SB2. So basically it said that the plaintiffs were likely to prevail on the merits and that without an injunction, without pausing the law, without putting it on hold, that there would be irreparable harm to the people affected by the law. So after that injunction was issued by the district court, the Ninth Circuit, which has been engaged in lots of anti-liberty, anti-Second Amendment shenanigans over the last several months, issued what's called an administrative stay. So they didn't even hear the case. They didn't even hear the arguments on the injunction. They just simply stayed the injunction, which meant that it would allow the law to go into effect on January 1st. And they issued that stay on December 30th, so right before the new year.
Can I just interject? The reason they did that, it's important to understand, just if you want to understand the Ninth Circuit administratively, they did that based upon a motion from the state of California that was filed as a, quote, emergency, end quote, motion. So this motion panel heard this, not on the merits. They just heard this emergency motion from the state of California.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, that's a helpful explanation, because this motions panel hears this emergency motion from the state of California. They issue the administrative stay on December 30th, which it really put a lot of folks in jeopardy, because you and I, we're kind of plugged into the Second Amendment and the law and the things going on with our right to keep and bear arms. But there are lots of folks who may have thought the injunction was still in place and could be violating the law come January 1st with that injunction stayed. Nevertheless, about a week later...
Well, don't forget what happens on January 1st.
The law goes into effect.
So now, basically, California is off limits to a law-abiding citizen to lawfully carry a handgun.
And that remained true for about a week. And then the merits panel, which is the panel that will hear the litigation on the injunction on the merits, my understanding is in April, they will hear the oral argument on that. They lifted or terminated the administrative stay so that the injunction would go back into effect. So the injunction is in effect with respect to California's sensitive places ban. And so I think that will probably remain the case at least until April, probably a couple of months after April, by the time the merits panel issues a decision about the injunction. Yep. So one place I would encourage you to check out, of course, the California Rifle and Pistol Association, I think, is one of the best organizations to follow with respect to litigation in California and in the Ninth Circuit. And of course, I think it's Costas Moros does a lot of the writing for their briefing in the case out there in May v. Bonta. So definitely check out California Rifle and Pistol Association if you want a lot of the best and latest information about what's going on there in California. So that's just a brief update. We wanted to follow up with all of you about that, because the information we gave in the last Monday Gun Day is now out of date since the merits panel terminated the stay on the injunction.
Yep.
So,
but the assault weapons ban, high capacity magazine ban in Illinois remains in place.
Yeah.
So in both of those cases, you're just going to have to bake a while. It's going to take a while before we get complete and final answers with respect to legislation in both of those states.
Yeah, exactly. All right, Mike. So I think that's where we'll leave it with SB2 for now. You want to get into body armor?
Let's talk about it.
All right, sounds good. Well, I think we're going to do a few episodes with a little bit of a common theme, sort of about the propaganda around ancillary equipment, ancillary devices to the firearm. A lot of times we talk about, and lots of folks talk about, the firearm and firearms themselves. But there's a lot of things like suppressors, body armor, pistol braces, things like that, where there's so much propaganda built up around those, and they're demonized.
Well, assault weapons.
Yeah, well, that's the firearm itself, right? Yeah, exactly. But propaganda, not only with respect to firearms, but with these ancillary devices and equipment. So one of those, of course, is body armor, which we're going to talk about today. So, Mike, what is body armor? I guess.
We'll talk. Let's get, before we get into that though, just in my mind, kind of the way I'm thinking about this right now, let's talk about the question about whether body armor is protected by the Second Amendment or not first, because that's always most important to me, is what the Second Amendment says about this issue of body armor. And we'll talk about exactly what body armor is. I think most of your listeners have an idea of what it is, but it's basically a piece of equipment that you wear that will protect you in some instances from bullets.
Yeah.
It's not bulletproof by any stretch. We'll talk about that, but let's talk about the Second Amendment first. Is it an arm that's protected by the Second Amendment?
Yeah. So as we all know, the Second Amendment protects an individual right to keep and bear arms, a pre-existing right to keep and bear arms. It doesn't provide us with that right. But the question, of course, is what is an arm within the meaning of the Second Amendment?
Yeah, and there's not a litigation on that. Well, strike that. There may be litigation on that, but we don't have clear guidance from the Supreme Court about whether or not body armor is absolutely protected by the Second Amendment. But we do have one case from the Supreme Court. It wasn't a full-blown case, so to speak, but a case where I think it was the state of Massachusetts outlaw or banned, I'm not sure what their statute did, it outlawed or banned or severely restricted stun guns. And the Supreme Court said in that case, listen, just because they didn't exist at the time of the founding, they're protected. They're an arm, although not necessarily a firearm in the traditional sense, they are protected. So that's really probably the best case we have from the Supreme Court where they've sort of expanded the definition of arms beyond what we might traditionally think of as a firearm.
Well, and I wouldn't even say, and I don't think you meant it this way, but I want to be clear with our listeners. The Supreme Court did not expand the meaning of arms, right? They were just trying to identify the contours of what it meant and what the founders meant by arms. And they, of course, did not, we all know, and very few people would dispute, that they meant only firearms.
Yeah.
Okay. Or else the Second Amendment would have said firearms, but it says it doesn't. It says the right to keep and bear arms.
Yeah. And no question about that. And thank you for clarifying that. But one thing that's of interest to me, I went back and I thought, how do we start doing research? And I got out my old copy of Black's Law Dictionary, actually from when I was in law school, 35 plus years ago. The thing was $14 then. So anyway, Black's Law Dictionary, if you don't know, is sort of an authoritative source in terms of dictionaries for the legal profession. But I looked up what arms means in terms of this definition in the dictionary. And it says anything that a man wears for his defense or takes in his hands as a weapon. So to me, if you just look at Black's Law Dictionary, I think there's a very good argument out there that body armor is in fact protected by the Second Amendment. I mean, I think about a knight. He may have had a sword, but he also wore body armor or had a shield. So to me, I think some very good arguments can be made that body armor is in fact an arm that's protected by the Second Amendment.
Yeah, and I'm going to link to this article here as well. I think it might be of interest to our listeners. It's an article from Only Guns and Money. It's a blog that John Richardson runs. He's been a frequent guest and co-host on the Polite Society podcast with Paul Lathrop. But the blog is called No Lawyers, Only Guns and Money, which I kind of like. I think that's a nice, refreshing take on things, right? Get rid of the lawyers. Let's just talk about guns and money. But anyway, the article is body armor protected by the Second Amendment? And he includes a definition down here from the Dictionary of the English Language from 1755, which I think is interesting. And oftentimes the Supreme Court goes back and looks at definitions from the time of the founding because especially originalist judges or justices, if they're on the Supreme Court, are trying to ascertain what did the founders have in mind? What was the original meaning when the Constitution and the Bill of Rights was adopted? What was the contract that the states supposedly signed on to, right? And the Dictionary of the English Language from 1755 says that arms are weapons of offense or armor of defense. Okay, so I think clearly
fits in squarely with body armor. It fits not only from an originalist perspective, but a textualist perspective. So even if you're just going by the pure meaning of the text, I think it clearly means and would include modern day body armor. So
while we don't have clear guidance, like you said, Mike, from the Supreme Court, I think that there's a good chance that the Supreme Court, if this issue came before the court, would say that body armor fell within the meaning and the protection of the Second Amendment.
Yep.
Of course, one thing we should mention, and I think we'd be remiss if we didn't mention, you mentioned the Caetano case with the stun guns. The court decided that case based on what's called the common use test, which was mentioned and described at fairly good length in the Heller case. But the idea is that any arm that is in common use for lawful purposes is an arm that's protected by the Second Amendment. Okay, and that doesn't mean just arms that were in common use for lawful purposes at the time of the founding, but it means modern arms that are in common use for lawful purposes as well. So, and that sort of analogy that we've heard a lot, we've made reference to, and lots of others have as well, between the First Amendment and the Second Amendment, right? It's not just, paper and papyrus and fountain pens that were protected by the First Amendment, right? It's modern day forms of communication as well. So it's the phone, it's the computer. There are all sorts of modes of communication that are protected by the First Amendment, much like there are modern forms of defense and arms that are protected by the Second Amendment.
Yep. So I think you summarized that, and thanks for finding that other dictionary definition. I'll get it out in a minute. Fortunately, maybe we can talk about this a little bit. We haven't seen litigation on this because in most states, and first of all, we're licensed in the state of Indiana, so do your own research particularly about other states and whether it's legal or not legal. And I would caution you about the usual culprits, New York, Massachusetts, Connecticut, those sort of states, about whether body armor is legal or not legal in your jurisdiction. I know New York has taken some steps to outlaw it. But in Indiana, anyway, I think, you correct me if I'm wrong, I think generally speaking, it's something a law-abiding citizen can own and use body armor for lawful purposes. Mm-hmm. And as long as you're not a convicted felon, or you don't use the body armor in the commission of a criminal offense, or then it's perfectly legal to have.
Mm-hmm. Well, we use Westlaw a lot to do our legal research, but I've pulled up the link here to Justia, which is a free online legal research reference. And I've pulled up Indiana statute here. Okay. It's Indiana Code 35-47-5-13. Talks about unlawful use of body armor. And it says pretty much what you've just said, Mike, that as used in this subsection, body armor means bullet-resistant metal or other material worn by a person provide protection from weapons or bodily injury. And it goes on in subsection B, a person who knowingly or intentionally uses body armor while committing a felony commits unlawful use of body armor, a level 6 felony. So it's lawful to use, and the statute doesn't say this, but it is lawful to have, to possess, to use body armor in Indiana, except when you knowingly or intentionally use it while committing a felony. Okay.
Yeah, and felons and convicted felons, I think, is another common prohibition.
Right. So, like you said, Mike, make sure people know the law in your state. There is some nuance in each state, but all states, it's my understanding, allow body armor, but there may be restrictions on how you can purchase it, for instance, and how you can use it. And when you can use it. And
by the way, I think probably most states are like Indiana. And as far as purchasing, most states are probably, you can purchase it in person or online, but there is at least a state or two, maybe more, that say you can only buy it in person. So anyway, it's much less regulated than firearms, that's for sure, as far as whether you can lawfully own and possess body armor. And I think that definition you provided, body armor is something you wear like a shirt or a jacket that's made of some sort of bullet-resistant material, whether that's steel or some other materials that we'll talk about.
And in the context where this, and I want to dwell on this, but I just want to mention it because this is where it comes up. I've seen in Indiana law, and it doesn't come up often at all. I've never had a case. I do a lot of criminal defense cases. I was going to ask you
if you've ever seen one.
I have never seen body armor come up in a criminal defense case, but I have read about it. There are very few cases. I did a little bit of research on Westlaw, and it seems like it comes up mostly in the context of resisting law enforcement. So where somebody is resisting law enforcement in a way that would be a felony. For instance, in Indiana, it would be a felony if you resist law enforcement with a motor vehicle. If you do that while you are wearing body armor, that is an additional felony, okay, for the unlawful use of body armor during the commission of a felony, which was the resisting law enforcement. So that's where I've seen it come up in the cases, but I've never seen it in any case that I've handled. So it's very, very rare.
It comes up some, but it is very, very rare. I think nationally, you see it in the news. I know the North Hollywood shooting that was in the late 90s, those two criminals, murderers, used, I'm not sure if they had commercially purchased or it was homemade body armor, but that was involved in that case. But it's used just very, very rarely.
Which goes to our next point, right? The propaganda, right? The picture that's painted by the media, by Hollywood, et cetera, is that body armor, things like body armor, are only used by criminals.
Yep. So yeah, and that's how they paint it. It's either used by criminals or the only other people that should have it is who? The government, of course. They want the government to have all kinds of firearms,
a monopoly
weapons,
on the use
on the use of force, and even the defensive implements as well. So keep that in mind. This is a defensive instrument, not an offensive instrument. But I don't think, though, that propaganda that you hear in the media about, why in the world would you want that? Only criminals would need that other than the police or the military is true. And maybe we can get some food for thought for your listeners to consider here. First of all, I have people think about home defense. If you've got a handgun or a rifle that's staged, maybe in a safe that you can get out real quickly if something happens in the middle of the night, it seems to me prudent to maybe have some armor there as well to put on. A lot of times we teach people that if somebody does invade your house, don't go looking for them. Call the police, stay in your safe room. It might be your bedroom. Barricade yourself if you can and wait. It seems to me it would be appropriate to maybe wait with some form of body armor on as well, in addition to some other offensive tool as well. And you may have family members, for instance, who are not able to handle a firearm. They don't want to handle a firearm. Your husband or your wife may not want to handle a firearm, but they may be willing to put on some body armor if something happens in the home.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a scenario that you can think about. Another one I would suggest people think about is for folks, particularly if you live in one of those jurisdictions where the school boards aren't going to do anything to help arm teachers to protect kids and take responsibility for the safety of our kids, you might think about putting some of this really small, thin level 3A. I'm talking about a definition I haven't defined yet, but some kind of small material that they can put in their backpack and train them how to use that in the event they're ever in a situation anywhere where there might be some sort of gunfire that they need to protect themselves from.
Mm-hmm.
There's also civil unrest scenarios where people might want it. There's just a myriad of situations where it may come up. Think about the COVID events we went through and the protests during that time. What if you lived in a city, you weren't a firearms person, and you were holed up in your apartment or your house and these things were going on outside? Yeah. It might be a time when you want some body armor.
Yeah. Or even today, I mean, think about it's kind of out of sight, out of mind for us because we live in rural Indiana. But even the protests with respect to the Israel-Palestinian conflict, right? I mean, there's all sorts of demonstrations and sort of mostly peaceful, but you never know when these sorts of things can get out of hand, especially in some of these larger cities. So if that's somewhere where you live and you want some extra protection, especially where you can't be armed otherwise, might be worth considering.
Yeah, and maybe this goes in the prepper category some, but I even read an article about the huge shortage of body armor in Ukraine, and people were making their own body armor. Even, quote, civilians were making their own body armor in those instances. So,
anyway. It's my understanding, I don't have the citation at hand here, but I'll try to find it when I'm putting together the show notes. My understanding is that body armor this is borne out from my personal experience with criminal defense, that it's used very little in crime and as little as like less than 1%. I don't know the exact number, but that's my understanding, that it's used very, very rarely in crime.
Yeah, and I think, like I said, like you said earlier, you were talking about the propaganda. Of course, if they can find one instance where it's used, they want to punish the entire public by outlawing it. Fortunately, they haven't decided to do that with cars yet. If a criminal uses a car in a criminal offense, maybe we should just eliminate cars for everybody, because then the criminals couldn't use them, assuming the criminals would follow the law, which of course they wouldn't.
That's interesting you mentioned that, because you see it happen in the United States, but I was listening to an interview with an Austrian lawyer about gun laws in Austria.
I saw that, so I want to see that. Yeah.
And he said that there was a guy some years ago, I don't remember what year, that used a pump action shotgun and apparently was pretty skilled with it, and injured and killed a bunch of people with a pump action shotgun. So in Austria, you are forbidden from having a pump action shotgun, but you can have a much more effective pump action rifle, much more accurate, much longer range, same rate of fire, all the things, but you can't have it because you can't have a pump action shotgun because it was used in one incident some time ago.
Yeah.
And so you're right. I mean, these anti-gun, anti-freedom politicians will jump on any horrible event for political purposes to deprive people of liberty and freedom.
Yeah.
So anyway, I think body.
So number one, we think it's protected by the Second Amendment. Number two, we think that there's some absolutely legitimate reasons you might want to think about buying some and having some. And I'm not a person that's of great imaginative capacity. There are probably lots of other areas where it could lawfully be used and save somebody's life. But the next question is, so if you're interested in it, where do you start in terms of doing the research? Where do you look?
Yeah. So where do we start, Mike?
Well, number one, I'm not an expert on body armor, but I've done some research, and so do your own due diligence here. But I'll say a few things about this area that I've done a little bit of research on for my personal use and then preparation for this podcast. First of all, kind of a disclaimer. Body armor is not necessarily armor first, and because you think armor is steel, it can be, but it's not necessarily rigid like that. But it's also not bulletproof. It's simply bullet resistant, and there can be a lot of materials that it's made out of, and we'll talk about those in a minute. So, but as far as standards, if you're going to look at body armor, whether it's soft body armor or hard body armor, which we'll talk about, NIJ is called it stands for the National Institute of Justice. It's a sub-department or a portion of the U.S. Department of Justice. It sets standards for the grading or evaluation of body armor. And I would suggest that you make sure whatever body armor you buy meets the criteria established by the NIJ. I think there's a lot of snake oil marketing out there with respect to body armor, so be careful. If you see if the advertising consists of some dude shooting a piece of body armor off a table, that's probably not a good not a good basis to be buying your body armor. Make sure there's some laboratory tests that have been submitted and it's certified to meet NIJ standards, that sort of thing. And watch the snake oil marketing that's out there. So then you're going to have to decide whether you want soft body armor or hard body armor. And we'll talk about hard or soft body armor first in a minute. But before we talk about the different kinds, one other area is the level of protection. Remember, I said body armor is bullet resistant material, not bulletproof. So fortunately, in a free society, you get to pick the products out there that you want to purchase. And these NIJ standards, in part anyway, establish different levels of resistance to bullets that the body armor may have.
And Mike, I'm going to try to share this image that you have saved.
Now, that's an image there that came from, what is it? We need to attribute that to them.
We'll go back and find it and make sure we include it in the show notes.
Yeah, it's, gosh.
But I think it's a helpful image probably for our listeners, if at least the ones that are watching this podcast by video.
It came from Spartan Armor, this image did.
Okay.
So make sure you attribute, to Spartan Armor. It's an image, and we're going to have some of their products here in a minute. We're going to show their website. But this came from their website.
I don't have it pulled up quite yet here, but
And I guess you can, this is not the whole screen, but it came from their website. Let me wait for you before I talk about it.
yeah, we got it pulled up now.
Yeah, I guess I need to talk about it because you got people that are just listening. But anyway, this is a good example of the different levels of body armor. First, you have level 3A. Then you have level 3 plus, which I don't think is necessarily an NIJ standard, but it's sort of an industry standard. It might be an NIJ. But then you have level 4. Level 3A is the lowest. You would think 3 might be, and then 3A would be next, but 3A is the lowest. It's basically going to stop handgun rounds, basically. There's some handgun rounds it won't, but for the most part, and you can see that in this diagram. So keep in mind, if most of the time as civilians, and by civilians I mean police officers as well, I'll put them in that category because they are civilians. That's what the threat's going to be, is going to be handguns. So level 3 then moves us up to rifle protection, and that's going to protect us from common AK rounds of 7.62 by 39 and common 5.56 ammo like the 193. Level 3 will not protect you from what we commonly refer to as green tip or 5.56 caliber 62 grain ammo. That has steel core, and it won't protect from that. There's this special threat plates out there that protect against that, and that's depicted in this diagram as level 3 plus. And then of course we have level 4, which is going to protect even from armor piercing 30-06 ammo, and it's basically going to be the highest level of protection you can get. So there's sort of what you're going to have to choose. And you might think, I just want the highest level of protection. Well, wait a second. The problem with that is, like most things, you're going to have to give up.
There's some compromise, right?
There's going to be some compromises there in terms of price, weight, thickness, mobility, comfort, lots of things. So, and I'll just tell you the end here. I would suggest most people, at least initially, think about just level 3A armor starting out. It's going to provide just protection against handgun ammunition for the most part.
Yeah. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about, we talked about the levels of protection, 3A through level 4. Let's talk about the different materials and these other considerations you've talked about weight and expense and those sorts of things.
Yeah. So the weight and the expense and the amount of protection, the comfort, all those things are things that you're going to have to consider and weigh. Level 3A is generally going to be soft body armor. It's going to be much more comfortable. It's going to be made out of like Kevlar, or what do they call it? Spectra fibers, I think it is. Think about how I think about it. If you're a fisherman, think about braided line, how thick, how tough that is, and but it's not very big for how small it is. So think about that kind of material. But they're flexible, they're thin, they're light. They'll sort of conform to your body a little bit. They're very concealable. You can wear them under garments and people won't necessarily know you have them on. I don't know that that's as important as they're light. And somebody else, we're talking about a kid or your wife or your husband, you can throw it to them and they can put it on and they'll have some protection against handguns. So they also fit closer to your body. So if you're in a close situation where you're struggling with somebody, it stays closer to your body. You can't be choked with it like you could with a metal plate or that sort of thing.
Okay.
Now, we also have probably I won't say the cheapest, but then we move to hard body armor, and we talk about steel there. And steel is, of all the hard body armor systems, is probably going to be the cheapest, but it's also going to be the heaviest. And with steel, you've got to worry about, so it provides lots of protection generally, but it's you got to worry about sprawl. And in fragmentation, what we mean by that is if anybody's shot at metal targets before, and the bullet hits the plate, it just splatters. You've seen the lead splatter there. That's what happens if it hits a steel plate that you're wearing as body armor.
You don't want to splatter up.
And splatter can come up in your, underneath
your jugular,
or whatever. Yeah. So you got to worry about sprawl with that. And they generally put special coatings on the steel to I won't necessarily say it absolutely prevents it, but at least to reduce it, the sprawl. So that's something you got to worry about more with steel. The thing about steel, though, is the positives. It's like I said, it's a little cheaper than some of the other products we're going to talk about in a minute, but it's heavy. You can drop it. You don't have to worry about it being in your attic and getting hot or it getting cold. I mean, it's incredibly durable. It's not going to crack if you drop it or throw it around, that sort of thing. And the shelf life, if you bought a steel body armor today, it's going to be good in 50. You can give it to Tate,
your grandkids,
and it'll be fine.
Yeah.
So, but it's very, very heavy. Okay. Another.
Our listeners don't know who Tate is yet. I haven't said.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, leave it as a mystery.
No. I'll say now. My wife and I had our first child. Tate was born Christmas Eve, and so I've actually been a little inconsistent with my podcast episodes since then, but trying to stay on track. And so yeah, maybe someday that Mike's grandson and my son can take over the steel body armor that we have.
Well, he's not ready for steel yet, that's for sure. Probably not even ready for the soft stuff. But,
right.
But anyway, although you could, I mean, if you needed to, you could. There's some soft stuff around you could shield him with if you needed to in a wrong situation.
Yeah.
Anyway, another material that you can think about, kind of going up the scale in terms of cost, is generally ceramic. And you think ceramic, oh my gosh, that just busts. Well, as a matter of fact, that's a downside of it. It's not as good in terms of rough handling. You don't want to throw that stuff around and beat it around because it can crack. But it's very good in terms of stopping bullets if it's used in a manufacturing process to make a bulletproof vest. You're going to get less spalling with it. And
part of that's right because why does it sprawl less than steel? Is it because it's somewhat flexible or because it cracks?
I think because it cracks and there's more absorption instead of simply just repelling the bullet.
Yeah.
Once again, I'm not an absolute expert on that, but that's what it does. It just absorbs it.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's a good thing about steel. Steel is, in my mind, going to be better for multi-hit. Ceramic's not necessarily going to be better for multiple hits, but ceramic is going to be much lighter.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And we're talking about a lot of times 2 plates, one in the front, one in the back. So if that steel plate weighs 6 pounds, that's a lot of weight because you got to have a carrier for it too. So anyway, but they're going to be more expensive. The ceramic stuff is. And then we have a third kind of category is the composite stuff. And it's sort of maybe the kind of the best of both worlds in terms of, providing protection and almost like steel, maybe in some are very good protection, a little more durable, and doesn't have a short shelf life. A lot of times you'll see ceramic rated for just like 5 years or something. Mm. But this composites, a lot of times they're made out of like a polyethylene material of some sort. And I'm not a chemist, but anyway, that's something that you may.
It reminds me sort of like we ride motorcycles, kind of like a material you might see a motorcycle helmet made out of to some degree. I don't know if it's the same or not, but that's what it reminds me of.
Yeah, it's more. I mean, I don't know that it's the same as the motorcycle helmets, how they make it. We'll talk about one of the manufacturers here in a little bit, but they can make it much lighter, much thinner. So it's you're dealing with less weight. So you've got these thinner, lighter plates that have a high level of protection. But guess what? Guess what the downside of that is? The cost.
Yeah. And like ceramic, composite is pretty much a one-time use, right? Like,
no, some of them right. That's one thing we'll talk about. You're going to have to look there. Well, one-time use, yeah. I mean, you're not going to want if it's
done.
But whether a plate has multi-hit capability is something that you want to look at. A lot of these plates are rated. I think the NIJ standard may say there's a standard for either a 5 or 6 hit capability.
Okay.
So,
all right.
And you got to be careful with some of them. That multi-hit capability, is it just in the center, or what do they protect when you get out closer to the edges? So that's a good question. And you'll have to do your due diligence there with respect to the whatever product you want. But I mean, it's like everything else. There's a compromise.
All right, so let's look, Mike. You've saved a few links here with just some examples. We've got Spartan Armor Systems.com pulled up, and we're not affiliated with them in any way. We just sort of picked them at random.
Well, actually, not random. I own some of their stuff. So.
Yeah, but we're not sponsored. We're not affiliated in any way. Just thought that they have good products and got a website here we're going to look at and just kind of go through a few examples.
Yeah, and this is kind of makes me think about something you may want to give to your wife or your husband or a kid, or, you could carry it around if you needed to. You could put it in a backpack for your child. Lots of things that you could do. But what I bought from them personally was some soft body armor. And I don't know how you're pointing to this stuff or whatever, but there's a little plate carrier there. I don't know if you can point to it. It's at the top there on the left. Well, no, that's not it.
Yeah,
it's got the hard stuff. Right there it is. Actually, that's multicam, but
yeah,
this has got really flexible, pliable material in it. It's almost like some sort of insulating. Well, it's not that light, but it's very easy, very light to wear, and it's just level 3A though, so it's only going to protect against most handgun rounds.
But you can see there, it's a vest with two plates, right? A front and a back plate. Yeah. And it looks like the range of the price there is $319 to $369.
Yeah,
for
depends
level
on what
3A.
size you want. Yeah, and then you can buy, just if you go on down, you can buy a backpack from them and put the
plate in the backpack.
Yeah, put the plate in the backpack. You can buy the material if you want and put it in your own backpack. You can buy different sizes. We have, so there's a place where you can look at some of that softer 3A type material. Like I said, that stuff's very pliable. And you can almost, I wouldn't suggest you do it, but you can almost bend it on itself. So anyway, that's one possibility people could consider or might want to research. Like I said, I'm not endorsing anything one way or the other, just telling you where I bought a little, and you might want to look at that. And that's a representative sample. Yeah.
And you can see here, you can sort, if you go to the homepage, you can sort by threat, you can sort by level of protection, by material, by lots of different ways here. So they help break down the options pretty well. Now you've got a few other sources here as well.
Yeah, we talked about the soft body armor. Now we'll go to the hard stuff, and we talked about ceramic. So here's a couple samples, and this is T-Rex Arms. Now these guys have probably forgotten more about body armor than I know, but I think it's a great company, reputable. These guys know their stuff. They're great shooters. They love freedom. At least I think they do. So here's a couple examples. I think it's the middle of the road in terms of price. These are ceramic plates. Hesco is the company they're selling right here. They have other stuff, and they have videos. You go there. We have an looks like that's out of stock. It's an L210 Hesco. And Hesco, by the way, is what I understand. I don't know what the Army's doing now for sure, but the Army used to use Hesco products, and they may still use Hesco products in terms of body armor. So it's a reputable company. They're not out there doing a lot of marketing because they mostly sell to government, but T-Rex Arms sells these. I think probably that's your best bang for the buck on the market, in all honesty, if you want hard armor. Hard armor plates. And these are going to be level 3 plus. They're going to be I think they're going to be rated for 5.56 green tip. Do your research here. But they've got an L310 and an M310. The only difference between the two, I think, is the M is what's called multi-curved versus just singularly curved. And what I mean by that is the body, your torso is rounded. The L is only rounded maybe this way horizontally, whereas the M is rounded this way as well, because your torso is rounded in two directions. So the multi-curve stuff is going to be a little bit more comfortable probably for you, and it's just going to fit better. That's all.
If you're watching this episode by video, you can see here on the website, it says the Hesco M210 is a multi-curve special threat plate capable of stopping most intermediate threats, along with some light armor piercing rounds like the M855A1 and the 7.62 by 39 API. So anyway, you can see here it says it's similar in construction to the single curve L210, but its multi-curve design greatly increases comfort and concealability. While not as cost effective as the L210, if you have the money, the improvements are worth it.
And I would submit to you that the multi-curve is worth the money. But like I said, your mileage may vary. But note this thing. What was the L? It's $380 for a set. Okay, keep that in mind, what I'm telling you. A set, the multi-curve, they're out of stock right now, but $380 a set. The M series is $610 to $810 a set, and that's going to depend on the cut. We can talk about that in a minute.
Yeah.
That's going to depend on the cut you want and the size.
Yeah.
So, but that's a set price. Okay?
Right.
So you can get for $380, you think, I'm not going to use it, but I want it in case something happens. You might buy the L series and put it in the closet, and
Right.
you got to be careful, and that makes sense to me for somebody that's probably not going to use it, because you're not, remember I said ceramic you can break it if you handle it a lot.
Mm-hmm.
You don't want to throw it on your your tank or whatever on a piece of metal, and it'll bust.
Right.
So that might be something folks want to think about.
Okay.
In terms of best bang for the buck. And keep in mind that thing's going to weigh, depends on which size you get. We're talking probably 5 pounds and I think 6/10 of an inch. So remember that, $380 for a set that's a 6/10 of an inch thick and about 5 pounds.
Well, I just stop sharing the screen, but I'll pull it back up here. They have the weight and size diagram down here that I just reshared. A small is 4.3 pounds, and all are the same thickness. But the large, or the extra large, is 6.7 pounds. So it ranges from 4.3 pounds to 6.7 pounds.
Yeah.
So that's for the M210.
So that may be the best bang for the buck out there. So let's look at something maybe some people would say is a little more primo, if you want to, and that would be Shot Stop is a company that makes armor. And this is some of that polyethylene material I was talking about. So it's going to be a little better than the ceramic probably, because you can throw it around a little bit more. I think it's got a 15-year warranty, but it's going to be more durable. Is it as durable as a steel plate? No, probably not. Nothing's going to be more durable than a steel, or very little is ever going to be more durable than a steel plate, but more durable than ceramic in terms of being able to throw it around, drop it, that sort of thing. I think it's got a 15-year warranty.
And this is a Shot Stop at shotstop.net.
Yeah, and they've got various plates. The one I happen to have is the Duridium, Duritium G2, and it's a special threat plate too. It'll stop basically green tip 5.56 and down. But what's the price? So it's going to be about 6/10 of an inch thick too, just like the Hesco, and it's going to weigh 3.8 pounds. So you're going to lose 1.2 pounds. It's going to be very light, very thin. You don't have to worry about throwing it around as much as the ceramic, but
$746
a plate, not
per
a
plate.
set.
Per plate, yeah. So you're looking at a comparable cost of basically $1,500 versus $600 to $800.
Mm-hmm. So anyway, so that's what you're looking at in terms of this concept that you don't get it, there's no free lunch.
Yeah. But there's a lot of options. That's the beauty of a free market, right? There's lots of options, lots of competition. You just have to know where to start and what to look for.
Yeah. But that $380, maybe that's why they're out of stock. It's a deal. That $380 L210 from T-Rex Arms, where they're selling the Hesco, that's kind of hard bang for the buck. That's going to be hard to beat.
Yeah.
So,
okay.
So some other things I mentioned a while ago, cut. You're going to have to choose, and you can look this up online. You're going to have to choose whether, you don't want this square thing because it's just not going to be comfortable. But they make shooter's cuts, which sort of kind of cut off the edge so you can move a little better and put a buttstock up there. They make swimmer's cuts, which are cut even more lower, making it more comfortable to move around. Of course, with everything else, to get something, being able to move around more, it makes the plate smaller.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't have as much coverage. So anyway, you're going to have to decide, what you want in terms of cuts. I'm not sure what I can add to that. Let me see if I've got a note here. Well, they have what's called SAMPI plates, small arms protective inserts. They're basically a shooter's cut, but they have radius corners on them that are rounded. So that's another thing to think about. I mentioned the edge-to-edge protection. Make sure you're getting something that protects not just the middle of the plate, but the going out. You'll have to make some decisions about sizes. Kind of 10 by 12 is usually typical for most people. You'll have to decide whether you want side protection or not, if you're going to go that route, versus just protection in the front and the rear. Trauma pads, sometimes you'll need that because different materials deform. They get hit, and then the back face deforms. And so some people think you need trauma plates. You may need trauma plates because of the back face deformation as well. Something else to think about. So there's lots of things to think about when you purchase these.
Yeah. Well, I think this is a great start for lots of folks that are considering body armor. And maybe if you weren't considering body armor, maybe you've figured out that, hey, this might be useful for me, or for there might be some use case for this, and something you might consider. So, Mike, I know you've got a few other resources here that I think we'd like to point out to people. One is Greg Ellifritz. He's got a link on his website, Active Response Training, where he talks about body armor. I think that might be useful for folks. The other one is a study that we thought was...
Well, I'm not sure about that study.
Yeah.
In terms of what it shows.
I'm going to try to... This is what I was referring to earlier. I'm going to try to find this study that supposedly shows that body armor is used in fewer than 1% of crimes. So this study we've linked to, I'll link to it.
It's violent crimes.
Violent crimes.
But I'm not sure I'm not sure about that statistic.
I'll link to this study anyway, just because it's sort of interesting, but it doesn't point to what it said that we thought it was going to point to. So we'll try to track that information down for you all and put it in the show notes. But with that said, Mike, what else would you like to say before we close up here about body armor and what people should consider?
I just think the other thing is, and we talked about the level 3A stuff, the soft stuff. That's not so hard in terms of carriers, but you're going to have to put if you want the hard body armor, you have to put it in something, which is what we call a carrier. And I would refer you to, I think Greg mentioned some different carriers, T-Rex Arms. I know they sell a lot of carriers. I mean, if you're just going to put it in your safe with your rifle, and, for that bump in the night thing, your safe room, maybe you don't need something that somebody that's dropping out of an airplane in Afghanistan needs, but do your research on the carriers as well. I know Crye makes good carriers. I think that's CRYE. I have an AR 500 armor carrier. I think they're Testudo. So anyway, Orion does, maybe, I'm not sure, but anyway, just do your research on the carriers as well. T-Rex Arms is a good resource for that, along with Greg Ellifritz's article.
Okay. Well, I will certainly link to most of these references that we've mentioned. I'll try to make sure that I get all of them. Of course, if people have questions, don't hesitate to leave a comment in the comment section. Mike, anything else you want to say before
we
close
do a
up?
little trivia thing?
Oh yeah, let's do it. So
I got a trivia question. Go ahead.
Well, I think, Mike, you spent most of the day yesterday teaching a NRA basic pistol course, and I think I don't know, was this trivia thing that was that the genesis of it? Thinking about it during the class yesterday.
It's kind of
yeah. So anyway, we're gonna just give a little piece of trivia here, and if people want to try to answer it in the comments prior to the next episode, we'll certainly look forward to your responses in the comments.
Yeah, I just thought it'd be something fun for people to think about. And yesterday's class in particular wasn't the genesis of this, but just teaching in general. And I thought, I don't know, it might be kind of cool just to see if people know as much as they think they know.
Yeah, and for that matter, if people have questions or topics that you'd like to hear us talk about, certainly let us know in the comments. We're happy to take listener feedback and talk about the things that you want to hear about.
All right, here's the question for the day then. A perceptible delay in the ignition of a cartridge after the primer has been struck by the firing pin is a misfire or hang fire?
Okay.
Do you know the answer to that?
All right.
If you're listening to this and you know the answer, awesome. If you don't, maybe it'll make you look it up and learn something.
Misfire or hang fire?
Yeah. What is it? A perceptible delay in the ignition of a cartridge after the primer has been struck by the firing pin.
All right.
Is it a misfire or hang fire? And we'll answer next time.
All right. Well, thanks. I think that's where we'll leave it for today, Mike. Thanks again for tagging along. Thanks everybody for tuning in. Of course, as always, you can find the podcast on YouTube, Rumble, Facebook by video. You can also find it by podcast on all of the most popular podcast streaming platforms. If you would, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. That helps us spread the message of freedom. And if you're on on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, leave a review. That helps us there as well. And of course, you can always find the show and the show notes on our website at forgeoffreedom.com. And you can follow me on Twitter at Forge of Freedom. So until next time, everybody, thanks for tuning in. I hope you learned a little something about body armor today. And until next time, remember, you are the Forge of Freedom.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Forge of Freedom. Be sure to subscribe wherever you heard this podcast so you never miss a future episode. For more information or to connect with Alex, you can go to forgeoffreedom.com or follow him on Twitter at Forge of Freedom. Until next time, remember, you are the Forge of Freedom.